My 2-year-old son accidentally shot me with a gun while I was pregnant. My name is Laura Ilg, and I was 31 years old and married. I was doing laundry when my 2-year-old son went into my husband's and my bedroom. Normally, this room was always locked, but not this time. That's when he managed to find my husband's gun, which we had for extreme emergencies, but we never thought it would be used, let alone in this way. As I was picking up the laundry, I had my back turned to my son, when suddenly he accidentally shot me in the back while I was 8 months pregnant. I managed to call for help, and I was transported to the hospital. Unfortunately, I passed away a few minutes later due to my son's actions and my own carelessness. The baby I had been carrying for 8 months also did not survive, as the doctors couldn't save it. Unfortunately, my husband's gun took my life while he was absent. So, after hearing my story, are you in favor of or against guns in the United States? I'm looking forward to your opinion in the comments.
Teenage cheerleader has been found murdered in her bath. Lisbeth Medina was a 16-year-old girl living in Texas. She studied at Edna High School, and her mum had actually recently moved to the area from Nebraska just the year prior. She was recently absent from a Christmas parade she was due to attend on the 5th of December. She'd actually planned to attend with her whole cheer squad, so it was very unusual that she didn't show up. Her mum decided to go and see where she was, and what she found was every parent's worst nightmare. Shockingly, she found her daughter in her pajamas, deceased in the bath. Due to her being found in her pajamas, authorities think this may mean she was killed before school on the day in question. Police believe that she is a victim of capital murder and have arrested a 23-year-old man. This is 23-year-old Rafael Romero. They have not yet released the girl's cause of death. Her auntie has launched a fundraising page for her family, and she states, "Any support that you can offer to my family at this time, anything is appreciated."
These are pictures with the most disturbing backstories, part 4. Okay, here we have this picture. And the man shown here is just a chef cooking some food. But a little while later, he tosses his head into the fryer, completely deep frying his entire head with oil and dying. And the most messed up part about this is that there's a video of it. Apparently the man was possessed by some sort of ghost or demon, or he had some sort of mental illness, which was even noticed by some of his co-workers. But in the video, the man rotates his head extremely weirdly and inhumane, and just throws his head into the deep fryer with no hesitation, leading people to believe that he was possessed. Because why else would any sane person just throw their head into deep frying oil? I don't recommend anybody watching or searching up the video because it is pretty disturbing. Mainly because it just comes out of nowhere. 1 minute the chef is just cooking food doing his job, and the next he starts twisting his head all weirdly and throws his head into the deep frying oil. I will probably never watch it again, and you should never.
I caught a brain-eating amoeba while swimming in an abandoned pool. My name is Caleb Zilgelbauer, and I was a 14-year-old in 2022 when my family decided to make the most of the summer by exploring local fairs and looking for a seaside house to enjoy our vacation. We found a house with a pool that wasn't in great condition, but the heat made us overlook this detail. We planned to explore nearby beaches and continue enjoying local attractions. However, we had no idea of the nightmare that awaited us. 5 days into our trip, I was plagued by fever, searing headaches, and even hallucinations. The next fragment of memory I managed to retrieve is waking up in a hospital, confused and terrified. Doctors quickly identified the cause of my torment. A brain-eating amoeba, a creature literally feasting on my mind while I innocently enjoyed my vacation. To make the situation even darker, this infection has a staggering mortality rate of 99%. My family was devastated, and I had only a 1% chance of survival. Doctors gave me no more than 4 days to live, but I survived.
So this happened on Sunday. A man has been charged with aggravated assault and other charges after police alleged that he intentionally crashed his car into a Pennsylvania home. This resulted in the vehicle being lodged in the home's roof and the second story. At around 3:15 p.m. on the 6th of August, an incident occurred in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania. A 20-year-old called Evan Miller allegedly drove his vehicle into this home on purpose. Police stated in a news release that they believed that this was an intentional act. Joan Lepley, whose house was the one in question, says that she was with her cousins when they all heard a commotion. Joan heard her relatives shout to her, "There's a man on your roof and there's a car on your roof." The vehicle is thought to have collided with the embankment outside of the house, causing the car to propel upwards into the roof. Thankfully, because of where the car hit on the roof of the house, nobody was injured. If it had hit the ground floor of the house, it could have been a very different outcome. The driver has been charged with multiple charges, including aggravated assault, recklessly endangering another person, and obviously careless driving. After a man disappeared under mysterious circumstances, a random person browsing on Google Earth accidentally solved the mystery. William Maltz was 40 years old when he vanished. He disappeared from Lantana in Florida on the 8th of November 1997. Now, he wasn't particularly drunk when he left to go home, and he called his girlfriend at 9:30 p.m. to say he was nearly home. The police launched a missing persons investigation when he failed to return home that night. However, there were very few leads and the case soon went cold. It would be an agonizing 22 years before there was any news of what happened to him. It wasn't until the 28th of August 2019 that a member of the public was browsing on Google Earth and noticed something strange. It was the manager of the Grand Isles housing development near Palm Beach who was looking at the area via the satellite images on the website. They noticed something in a pond that looked like a submerged car. Police were notified and sent officers to investigate. The car was removed from the water and had clearly been under there for an extended period of time. It had completely rusted, and inside, as you may have guessed, were human remains. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains were William. The area had been a building site at the time of William's disappearance. It was concluded that he must have lost control of his car on his ride home and accidentally gone into the pond. His family were now finally able to have some closure and lay him to rest. This horrific murder will put you off ever buying off Facebook Marketplace again. Denise Williams was a 54-year-old mother of two from Pennsylvania. She worked as a nurse and lived in Hornerstown. It was April 2021 and she needed to buy a fridge for her boyfriend. As many people frequently do, she looked on Facebook Marketplace to try and get one secondhand. She had no idea it would cost her her life. She found the fridge that she wanted and contacted the seller, who was Joshua Gorgon, who was 26. After travelling to his house to pick up the fridge, she never made it back. Now, her family's quick thinking at this point undoubtedly played a massive part in the investigation. They reported her missing to police and provided them with the details of the Facebook seller post. Police were able to hunt down the seller's address and turn up. There they found a hideous crime scene. Several knives were found, and it transpired that Denise had been stabbed to death. Her car was discovered in a car park of a Richland Township shopping centre 4 blocks away. Fresh blood was found on the driver's side door. Tragically, Denise's brother Bobby Williams Jr. had actually been shot and killed in 2013 in an unrelated incident. Her family now had to grieve another homicide. It's believed that Denise and Joshua had had a disagreement about the price of the fridge. Things had clearly escalated horrendously. Joshua had stabbed the nurse multiple times before moving her car and phone from the scene in an attempt to throw police off the scent. Investigators stated it was clear that Denise had put up a massive fight to try and defend herself. He was given life plus 24 years in prison.
This famous Hollywood actress allegedly groomed a 7-year-old and assaulted him when he was 17. This is Asia Argento. She has been in a lot of movies, including a lot of horror movies like George Romero's Land of the Dead. Her father is infamous Italian horror film director Dario Argento. And Asia Argento was dating Anthony Bourdain before his death. So when the Me Too movement was happening back in the 2018-2017 time, Asia came forward and accused Harvey Weinstein of assaulting her. She became one of the faces of the Me Too movement, which was a movement dedicated to listening to victims and believing them. Asia also claimed that another film director had drugged and assaulted her on the set of a film. But in 2004, Asia met young actor Jimmy Bennett on the set of a film. At the time, Jimmy pictured here was only 7 years old. As Jimmy grew older, he and Asia allegedly kept in contact. And in the year 2013, when Jimmy was only 2 months past his 17th birthday, Asia allegedly invited him to her hotel room, plied him with alcohol, and then assaulted him in a number of ways. So right after Asia came out and talked about her experiences with Harvey Weinstein, that's when Jimmy decided it was time for him to talk too. And quietly, behind closed doors, it was arranged that Jimmy would be paid almost $400,000 to keep quiet. Jimmy would even claim later on that he was inspired by the Me Too movement himself to speak about his own assault. Now, initially, Asia denied all these allegations to news outlets and said that his story was completely false. But then, after these denials were made public, evidence came out. A photograph was published of Asia wearing absolutely nothing while in bed with Jimmy, and there were also text messages made public where she admitted to assaulting the minor and said that it felt weird and that she didn't know he was a minor. Now, Rose McGowan actually came out and said, "We don't know the full details of the situation, show restraint and be gentle to Asia." And people absolutely roasted her because what she was saying was directly in contradiction to the entire purpose of the Me Too movement, which was to believe survivors of assault. Eventually, Asia's attorney admitted that there was an encounter between her and Jimmy, and she was fired from her position as a judge on the X Factor. Now, there are a lot of conspiracies dealing with Asia Argento and her late boyfriend, Anthony Bourdain. If you guys want me to talk about those, let me know in the comments section below. Breaking news, a shootout between this guy and the FBI 2 years ago has just led to a massive arrest of over 100 members of a global pedophile network. This is a tragic and sad story, but I'm thankful that these people are being arrested and brought to justice. So this is David Lee Huber. He was born and raised in Louisiana, but he eventually moved to southern Florida where he lived for most of his life. And on February 2nd, 2021, the FBI showed up to his front door because they were serving a warrant for his involvement in a CP case. And apparently the things that this guy was doing involving the CP were graphic and disturbing, so they sent out a huge force to take him in. So when agents first showed up at his door to serve this warrant, he saw them on his Ring doorbell camera, grabbed a rifle, and immediately began firing at them. A lot of the officers returned fire, but unfortunately 2 officers were struck and killed immediately. These were officers Daniel Alfin and Laura Schwarzenberger. Laura was killed instantly, but Daniel was hit and managed to return fire before he was killed. So after an absolutely massive police presence showed up and began returning fire, Daniel Lee Huber then barricaded himself inside of his home, returned fire a few times, but eventually took his own life. This obviously led to a massive response from the authorities, and when they looked into the computers and devices that he had in his possession, they were shocked. So apparently Daniel Lee Huber had been tied into an international pedophile ring. This ring operated on the dark web, they had highly encrypted file sharing devices, and this network spanned the globe. And when they found out that this guy was connected to all these other people, an international investigation was launched. Part of this investigation was focused in Australia, where a bulk of the people committing these crimes were located. I mean, all this was made public just yesterday, but the Australian suspects that were just arrested are between 32 and 81 years old. They're highly intelligent, as was stated on the release. They know how to manipulate computers and internet networks. And a lot of these members of this ring were producing and sharing their own CSAM or CP, which means that these men were some of the worst of the worst. But this led to an international investigation, like I said, and people were arrested here in America as well, a number of pedophiles that were attached to this network. So I definitely would consider this a win. Obviously, we don't know yet who was connected to this, what's going to come out of this, or exactly what these people were doing, but I think this is a step towards justice. And sadly, these 2 agents who heroically sacrificed their lives trying to protect children ended up saving so many more. But yeah, just here in America, 43 people connected to this investigation have already been arrested for producing CP, possessing CP, all of that. And I'm hoping they will arrest hundreds more.
John Jarvis hated smoking with a passion, and it was his hatred for his wife's habit that led to him killing his whole family. It should have been a clean break for this family when they moved into and started running the Winslow Hotel in Blackpool, but their joy at this opportunity was short-lived. It was early on in 2003 when John found a packet of cigarettes in his wife Trisha's coat pocket. He'd asked her to kick the habit multiple times, and she'd even signed a prenup agreement when they got married to say that she'd limit herself to 6 cigarettes a day, but to John, even 1 was too many. John had told Trish that if she didn't stop smoking, he'd divorce her, and he'd even gone as far as telling a friend that he'd kill her. He hated the smell of smoke in the house and on his and the children's clothes, and when Trish lit up a cigarette and smoked it right in front of him, he decided something had to be done. In March 2003, John and Trish went out to the pub one night and there was a psychic giving readings. What she said to John was the final push that he needed to murder his wife. She said, "Do what you failed to do 5 years ago and sort it out." That night, while he lay next to his sleeping wife, he reached into his bedside drawer and took out a hunting knife. He rolled over and began stabbing Trish over and over. She woke up screaming, but eventually she fell still and silent. But that wasn't enough for John. Shockingly, he decided that she could be resuscitated if she was taken to hospital, and she'd be then free to carry on with her smoking habit. So he did the one thing that he knew would stop that happening. He cut out her heart. John then saw someone standing in the doorway watching him. It was his youngest son, 7-year-old Stuart. He was shaking and crying. John walked over to him and stabbed him to death. He then walked to his other son's bedroom, 11-year-old John. He calmly said, "You're going to join your mother," and he stabbed him to death too. It later came out that in John's mind, these were mercy killings. He had stopped his sons from growing up knowing that their father killed their mother. He then wiped the blood from his hands and face and went and sat down at his computer. He started to write out a message, and it read, "Smoking by my wife to all it may concern. She never stopped, and if I only divorced her, I would always be reminded of the fact that she lied to me. So you will all see and learn I have given her and the boys absolute freedom. Forgive me for taking this drastic measure." He then typed in the names of Trish's 2 brothers and pressed send. The next morning, John and Trish's teenage daughter went to wake her brother for school, and she found him dead in a pool of blood. She found her parents' bedroom door locked, so she called for help, and the police eventually arrived. The police kicked in the basement bedroom door and found Trish dead and John laying next to her with a knife wound to his chest. He was still alive after attempting to take his own life. There was a Bible on John's nightstand that lay open at the book of Revelation, and the passage related to the coming of the beast. It was propped open with Trish's cigarette lighter. Leading up to the trial, it actually came to light that John had an undiagnosed mental health condition after being involved in an accident as a teenager, and he pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge accepted this plea and he was detained at Ashworth Hospital in Liverpool, where he remains indefinitely.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This is by far the worst cartel video ever released, and whatever you do, don't go looking for it. Before I begin, I can't stress enough how bad this video is. Whatever you do, never go searching for it. The full version of the video is 6 minutes long, and the video is shot in the nighttime in some sort of desert location. You see the victim, who has been blindfolded with his hands tied behind his back, and he is also wearing a white t-shirt that spells out the cartel he belongs to. The scene seems to be lit up by the car lights, and the victim is surrounded by multiple heavily armed cartel members. They are wearing all black tactical gear and carrying high-grade weapons. One of the cartel members then begins to read a statement, and as he's doing this, the cameraman starts to move closer to the victim. After the statement is finished, the victim is forced to the ground face down in the dirt. Multiple cartel members hold him down by stepping on his back and pulling back his arms. The victim has been completely immobilized so they can carry out this awful act of violence. The victim doesn't make a sound as he awaits what's about to happen to him. After the victim has been restrained and pinned down, a cartel member carrying some kind of large knife slices a vertical cut on the back of the victim's head. He does this as a starting point to flay and scalp the victim as he is still alive. After the cut, blood starts to puddle on the dirt floor, and using the initial cut, the cartel member slices under the victim's scalp and starts to remove it from the skull. As he cuts, he pulls the skin back to ease the blade cutting underneath the scalp. After a few seconds, the back of the victim's head has been completely scalped. However, the cartel member makes sure not to cut the skin off in chunks and instead attempts to complete the scalping and flaying in one clean go. After the skin on the back of the victim's head has been severed, the cartel member then moves to removing the skin and hair from the sides of the victim's head. While doing this, he also cuts off the victim's ears. The back of the victim's skull looks like a red ball with shades of white from the victim's skull also showing. The top of the victim's head is then scalped. The victim is still alive, but somehow has yet to make a sound. Not even one scream. The victim is then turned over on his back, and as this is happening, a cartel member puts his boot on his chest to stop him from moving, and at this point, the victim, who is still conscious, says his first words, and despite the awful and intense pain he must have been going through, he tells the cartel member to simply stop stepping on his chest in a very calm manner. But as he's lying on his back, a cartel member then flays the skin off of his face. He pulls the skin that has already been flayed and starts to cut down from the victim's forehead. And as the blade slices under the skin, you hear a tearing type sound, which is just awful. After about 20 seconds, the cartel member completes the flaying, but he realizes he missed a few pieces of skin on the victim's cheek. He then goes back and cuts the remaining skin off. The victim also has his nose cut off, and what is left of the victim is a horrific sight. His head looks like a red skull, and due to the lack of skin, it makes his teeth and eyes way more prominent. The detached scalp and face is then placed on the victim's chest, and the cartel member then finishes off the victim by cutting deep into his throat, and it appears to finally kill the victim. The cartel member then cuts off his tongue and takes off his shirt. He then plunges the knife deep into the victim's chest and cuts vertically, exposing all of his organs. The victim at this point has lost so much blood that it doesn't even cause bleeding. The cartel member then reaches into the victim's chest and cuts out his heart. The heart is still beating, and he then holds it up to the camera. The cartel member then kneels down next to the deceased victim as the camera focuses on the still beating heart. The last 2 minutes of the video is the cartel member still holding the beating heart in complete silence. Nobody talks, and all you hear is the wind blowing until the heart stops beating and the video concludes. Whatever you do, please don't go searching for this video. Just when you think you've seen it all, a video like this surfaces. I can't stress enough how bad this video actually is. It's just crazy knowing that this is happening in real time to real people, and it's just awful knowing that stuff like this happens on a daily basis.
This is Peter Scully, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. I'm about to tell you his story, but seriously guys, this one is incredibly disturbing. It's so dark, and viewer discretion is really advised for this video. So Peter Scully, he's still alive. He was from Australia, he had a family there, but he was engaging in criminal activities, and he eventually fled the country and moved to the Philippines. And this is where the darkness really began. While he was in Australia, Peter Scully started up an international child sex abuse ring. The things that were done to these kids are, I can't even talk about them here on TikTok, but he also started up a pay-per-view video service. And with these videos, he was producing CP, but one of the most extreme forms of CP that can possibly be produced. So how did all this happen? Well, when he was out living in the Philippines, Peter Scully had 2 Filipina girlfriends. They would go out to the streets, they would find kids that needed money or looked impoverished, they would bring them back to the house they shared with Peter, and the things that went on afterwards are literally unspeakable. Remember, like I mentioned before, Peter was the head of an international ring of people that enjoyed the abuse of kids, and he provided videos for these clients. But his most infamous video was titled Daisy's Destruction. This video that he produced was so extreme, so hardcore that people on the internet, when they heard about what happened in the video, literally thought that it was an urban legend, and they thought that there was no way this could be real. This is an actual screenshot of the beginning of the video. This is a screenshot from the very beginning of the video. In the video, 3 young girls are repeatedly tortured for hours and hours on end by Peter Scully and his 2 girlfriends from the Philippines. They are beaten, they are sexually abused. I can't even describe, like I said on TikTok, some of the things that happened in this video. And 18-month-old Daisy. Now keep in mind that all of this was on camera. That's the most disturbing part of this. One of Peter's victims actually ended up dying. They were buried in his house. And this sick individual literally sold that video footage across the world. And what's even more disturbing is that there were lots of people willing to pay to see that video. I'm not kidding. People were paying $10,000 to view this video. That is absolute insanity that there are people that sick out there in the world. And this is only the beginning of the crimes that this guy carried out. Some of the other stuff that we're going to touch on is absolutely disgusting. It's just horrific. And the story of how Peter Scully was eventually identified and arrested is extremely captivating. I'm going to run out of time here on this video, but if you want to see a part 2, let me know below. This story is far from over. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, did not act alone. This TikTok series is about to blow your mind, but there's a lot of information here, so proceed with caution. The case of John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer clown, is one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history. A brief overview of the case. In the 1970s, John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men. He buried them in the crawl space beneath his home and his yard, and he was connected to a number of different crimes. Gacy himself gained infamy because he dressed up as Pogo the Clown on the weekends and volunteered at hospitals and children's birthday parties. Now, the official story says that John Wayne Gacy acted completely alone. He had no help in carrying out any of these murders, but I really don't believe that that's the case. Through all of our research that we did for our podcast, we've determined that Gacy was connected to a number of other killers, pedophiles across America. And he even may have been connected to one of America's other most infamous serial killers, the Candyman out of Houston, Texas. So before we get into this, I want to state that I do believe that Gacy did murder some people, and I think he was very complicit in all of this, obviously, but I don't think that he acted alone. But why do I think that? So to start off, we need to talk about Jeffrey Rignall, this guy who was actually a survivor of John Wayne Gacy. After a night of abuse and essay at the hands of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Rignall was allowed to go free. But what Jeffrey would go on to tell authorities and the media about what happened that night at Gacy's home is a major thing in this whole conspiracy. Now, Jeffrey would tell the police that while Gacy was essaying him, there was another man in the room. Now, whether or not this other man participated in the essaying or they were there to watch, it doesn't matter. Someone was watching this criminal act occur. He knew he could give a description of the guy, and he knew that someone else was there watching this happen. Then we get to Robert Bob Gilroy, who was a victim of John Wayne Gacy. So Robert Gilroy was abducted on September 15th, 1977. That's the official date that he went missing. He was supposed to show up for an event after that day, but he never showed. But John Wayne Gacy's plane tickets and records placed him as being out of the state at the time. His plane tickets from the time show that Gacy left Illinois on September 12th, and he didn't return until September 16th, the day after Robert Gilroy went missing. Already, these two facts point to a larger conspiracy at hand. There may have been people helping procure victims for Gacy, and he may have been even paying for these victims. And that's when we get to Philip Paskey and John David Norman, two of the most horrific people I've ever read about, and this is where the connections with the case start to get really shocking. And we've talked about John David Norman here on my TikTok before. This guy was connected with the higher-ups in the government. This guy had lots of political power, and he was a known pedophile. Remember, in earlier TikToks, I even told you about how John David Norman was arrested multiple times. He had Rolodexes full of index cards of the people who he was supplying these young men to. And both times, the police departments lost the Rolodexes and lost all the names of the abusers. But how did they connect to Gacy? Well, in part 2, we're going to talk about it. This island has one of the most disturbing histories in America, and no one really knows the full truth behind it. So like I said before, this island was owned by multi-millionaire Francis Sheldon, pictured right here. And Francis and a number of other local men from Michigan, including this guy, Gerald S. Richards, ran a boys' camp on the island. They would fly kids to the island on this airstrip, kids from the YMCA and other schools and communities in the area. And both the children and the parents of the children who attended this boys' camp were told that this was an island of fun where kids could relax. They had big brothers there. It was going to be totally safe. And this camp ran on this island for a period of years. Then one day, some of the kids who attended the camp began to tell their parents that the counselors or the teachers, the adults that were there on the island, had behaved with them in very, very inappropriate ways. They began telling their friends and parents that they were taken into these cabins pictured here on the island. They were assaulted. They were told to remove all of their clothing and that there were cameras all over the place. Well, it turns out that this guy, the multi-millionaire with political and business connections in the area, Francis Sheldon, was running a massive CP ring. And they had been abusing the children on this island under the guise of bringing them to a boys' camp for years, recording all of it, selling it across the world. And some of the more affluent clients of their business were even allowed to take trips to the island themselves to see some of these young boys. Now, this story bears an obvious resemblance to the story of Jeffrey Epstein, but there are some very, very strange things that are happening here that nobody knows about, and the government still refuses to talk about to this day. So let's talk about this guy, Gerald S. Richards. He was a gym teacher at a local Catholic school who went down for the crimes, and he was heavily involved with every aspect of this business, if you know what I mean. Well, it seems like through his political and business connections, Francis Sheldon was actually tipped off that he was about to be arrested and raided and charged with these horrific crimes. So Francis, before he could be brought to justice for these crimes, he actually fled the country in a personal plane. He then moved to France, got remarried, and died in Amsterdam, and never had to pay for any of the crimes that were committed here. But it's when we start talking about the murders that this story really starts to blow my mind. So take a good look at this guy, Chris Bush. This is Christopher Bush's father, Harold Lee Bush. Now, he was an executive with General Motors, and the family was obviously extremely wealthy. They were politically connected, and they were very connected to every business in the area. These guys had a lot of power. But back to Christopher Bush. This guy had assaulted a number of children. He'd been let out of prison, let out of jail in a very, very suspicious way multiple times, put on bail for serious offenses. And he was an alleged associate of the crime ring that was happening on North Fox Island. Meaning that, like I said earlier, he was one of those people who could afford to actually fly out to the island to do things himself. I'm out of time. Follow for part 3. This is where it gets juicy.